In a mansion where echoes once carried the sound of laughter, silence now reigned like a wan, cruel master. Alexander Reed, a billionaire whose life looked flawless from the outside, had become a hollow man behind closed doors. Since the tragic loss of his wife, Isabella, the grandeur of his estate no longer felt like home, it felt like a mausoleum. The rooms were immaculate, yet suffocating, the kind of silence that weighed heavier with each passing day. His twin boys, Oliver and Mason, had once been bright sparks of mischief and joy. Now, their laughter had vanished, replaced by blank stares and quiet footsteps that mirrored their father's grief. They moved like shadows in their own home, retreating deeper into sorrow as if afraid joy itself would betray their mother's memory. Alexander, desperate to survive the crushing weight of loss, buried himself in endless meetings, business deals, and late nights at the office. To him, the answer was distraction. If he worked hard enough, maybe the ache in his chest would dull. But grief is not a problem solved by numbers on a spreadsheet. It lingers. It gnaws, and it multiplies in silence. Every evening, when Alexander returned, he found his sons more distant than the night before. The once colorful drawings taped to the refrigerator had stopped appearing. The toy cars and building blocks remained untouched in their boxes. Meals ended in quiet refusals, and bedtime became a battlefield of tears and exhaustion. Alexander told himself he was doing his best. Yet a gnawing guilt whispered otherwise. He had lost Isabella, but in his inability to face his pain, he was also losing Oliver and Mason. The house stood as a grand symbol of wealth, but within its walls lived a broken family. What once felt like a safe haven now mocked them with emptiness. And though Alexander never said it aloud, he feared the silence was winning, that grief was slowly consuming not only him but the two innocent souls he had sworn to protect. It was a beginning born of loss, a fragile place where hope seemed impossible. Yet beneath the sorrow, a story was waiting to unfold, one that would ask whether love could rise again from the ruins of despair. The first time she entered the Reed mansion, nothing about her arrival hinted at the storms she would come. Her name was Celine Carter, and to Alexander Reed, she was just another quiet hire, another pair of hands meant to keep the vast estate running in order. She walked with soft steps, her head slightly bowed, her dark curls pinned loosely away from her face. There was nothing grand about her presence, no fanfare, no promise of transformation. She was simply there to work, to do what was asked, and disappear quietly into the background like so many before her. But grief has a strange way of reshaping the ordinary into something extraordinary. And on that rainy afternoon, when Alexander returned home earlier than expected, the air of the mansion was no longer heavy with silence. Instead, it vibrated with something he hadn't heard in months: music. A gentle humming, imperfect yet warm, floated down the long hallway. For a moment, Alexander froze, believing he was imagining things. But then, as he moved closer, the sound mingled with another laughter. Not his own, and not polite laughter, exchanged among strangers, but the kind that bubbled up freely, innocent and unrestrained. His twin boys, Oliver and Mason, were in the living room, spinning in wild circles across the polished wooden floor. Their socks slid dangerously against the smooth surface as they shrieked with joy. And at the center of their orbit sat Celine, kneeling among a pile of pillows, her arms wide open, her voice encouraging them with playful threats of capture. "You can't escape me, mister," she teased, her smile radiant, her tone light. Alexander's breath caught. It had been so long since he'd seen them like this alive. Oliver, who had refused to touch his cereal that very morning, now hurled himself onto Celine's lap, laughing so hard, his cheeks flushed pink. Mason, usually withdrawn and clingy, squealed as he tackled her from behind. For a heartbeat, the sight pierced Alexander's chest with both wonder and pain. They were not ghosts anymore. They were children again. And then it happened, the word that shattered and mended him in the same instant. As Celine adjusted her position, pulling both boys into her lap, Mason leaned into her shoulder and whispered, "Mommy." The word came soft but deliberate, and Oliver, never to be outdone by his brother, echoed it joyfully, "Mommy." The sound cracked something inside Alexander. He stood frozen in the doorway, torn between outrage and awe. That single word was sacred, tied irrevocably to Isabella, the woman he had buried, and the love he thought irreplaceable. Hearing it spoken again, not to her memory, but to another woman, felt like betrayal. And yet, as his heart recoiled, his eyes betrayed him, because there, in front of him, his sons were laughing again. They were breathing joy into the clueless walls of a home that had suffocated under sorrow. They were calling someone else mommy. Yes, but they were living. Celine noticed him at last. Her eyes flicked up, startled for only a second before steadying. She did not recoil. She did not pry the children away or apologize. Instead, she held them close, as though to remind him that she hadn't asked for this, that she hadn't tried to replace anyone. The twins had chosen the word themselves. And in her calm gaze, Alexander saw not guilt, but truth. They needed someone to hold on to, she said quietly, as though answering the unspoken question on his lips. That's all. That night, Alexander barely slept. He paced the length of his room, haunted by the sound of that word, mommy, and the softness in Celine's voice when she offered her explanation. He had wanted to be angry, to reassert boundaries, to remind himself and his children that Isabella was irreplaceable. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Oliver's flushed cheeks and Mason's wide smile. He saw joy reborn in their faces because of her. And no matter how much it hurt, gratitude stirred within him, tangled and inescapable. Days passed, and Celine continued her quiet work in the house. She did not seek his approval, nor did she demand recognition. She folded laundry, cooked simple meals, read bedtime stories, and hummed lullabies from a childhood long past. But it wasn't the tasks that mattered. It was the way she filled the space around her, with patience, with warmth, with a steadiness that grief could not penetrate. The twins began to seek her out, arms lifted for comfort, giggles bubbling at her playful whispers. Slowly, she became their anchor, the safe place they had lost when Isabella died. Alexander observed from a distance, both moved and unsettled. Part of him felt replaced, edged out of their healing, while another part saw the truth he could not deny. Celine had given his sons something he could not. She had reached them. She had broken through the silence that all his wealth, all his desperate busyness, could not touch. One evening, standing at the top of the stairs, Alexander heard Celine singing again. The twins' door was cracked open, and her voice carried through the darkened hallway, soft, melodic, filled with something deeper than words. It was not for him, and yet it reached him. All the same. He sank quietly against the wall, unseen, and let her song unravel the grief he had locked away. For the first time since Isabella's funeral, tears traced down his face, not with shame, but with release. From that moment on, Alexander could not deny it. Celine Carter had done what he had thought impossible. With nothing more than a song, a touch, and a word, she had awakened life in his sons and cracked open the walls he had built around his own heart. It frightened him, yes, but it also left him humbled. For Celine had not been hired to heal. And yet, by simply being herself quiet, steady, unassuming, she had begun to mend what grief had tried so hard to destroy. At first, Alexander Reed's reaction to Celine Carter's presence was not gratitude, it was distance. He built walls, tall and unyielding, around every part of himself that still bled. It was easier to act cold than to admit how deeply her quiet influence unsettled him. She had done what he, with all his power and wealth, could not. She had given Oliver and Mason back their laughter. And though that should have filled him with relief, it filled him instead with a gnawing fear. Each time the boys called her mommy, his chest constricted with betrayal. To him, Isabella was still everywhere, her laughter in the corners of the house, her perfume lingering in the grist folds of clothing he hadn't been able to pack away, her memory etched in the lines of their children's faces. Allowing another woman to step into that sacred space felt like disloyalty, like erasing the woman he had vowed never to forget. And so, he pulled back. Celine felt the change almost immediately. Where once Alexander had offered small, hesitant conversations in the kitchen about nap schedules or grocery lists, he now offered clipped words and formal instructions. His tone sharpened, his eyes avoided hers, his posture grew rigid. He left earlier in the mornings, returned later at night, and when he did cross paths with her, it was as though she were an invisible part of the furniture, necessary but unacknowledged. It wasn't anger, it was fear. Fear that his boys would forget Isabella's face. Fear that he, himself might find comfort where he believed he should only feel pain. Fear that if he let Celine in, even a fraction, he would betray the memory of the woman he had buried. And so, he retreated behind silence, convincing himself that coldness was the safer choice. But Celine did not leave. She did not flinch under his distance. She did not demand explanations or apologies. Instead, she stayed. Patient, steady, unwavering. She poured herself into the children, as if their needs were louder than the silence pressing in around her. She held Oliver when nightmares woke him in the middle of the night. She hummed Mason to sleep with songs from her childhood. She learned which toys calmed their fears, which words drew their smiles. She wiped their tears with a gentleness that asked for nothing in return. And Alexander, try as he might, could not ignore it. Some evenings, passing by the playroom, he caught glimpses he could not erase. Celine sitting cross-legged on the floor as Oliver leaned against her shoulder, Mason curled into her lap, both boys safe in a peace he had been unable to give. Other times, late at night, he heard her soft voice drifting through the walls as she sang to them, her melody anchoring the restless house in warmth. Each moment struck him like a blade and a balm, sweet because it was real, bitter because it reminded him of his own failure. He should have been the one to reach them. He should have been the one to soothe their cries, to rekindle their laughter. But grief had hollowed him out, leaving him a stranger to his own children. Celine, without trying, had become their safe place. The turning point came quietly, almost accidentally. One morning, Celine entered a room no one else dared to touch, Isabella's bedroom. The door had remained closed since the funeral, a shrine sealed against time. Alexander returned from the office earlier than usual, and found her there, smoothing a cardigan over the chair, straightening a picture frame, dusting the manor bedside table with the sleeve of her sweater. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice cracked like thunder in the still air. Celine turned calmly, her hands still resting on the blanket. She did not flinch, did not stammer apologies. Her gaze met his, steady and unafraid. "I was just cleaning," she said, softly. "This room has been still for too long." His jaw tightened, anger trembling beneath his skin. "You had no right," he hissed, his words taut with emotion. "Maybe not," she replied, her voice steady as a prayer. "But love doesn't belong behind locked doors." The sentence fell between them like a stone, rippling outward into places Alexander had refused to face. He stood frozen, his breath caught in his chest, because the truth of it burned deeper than any anger he could muster. Love wasn't meant to be locked away, preserved only in silence and memory. Yet that was exactly what he had done, not to honor Isabella, but to protect himself from the unbearable weight of her absence. He turned and left without another word, but her sentence clung to him like a haunting melody. All evening, as he sat in his study staring at untouched documents, her words gnawed at him. Love doesn't belong behind locked doors. He tried to silence the echo, but it would not be silenced. It was the truth he had buried, now unearthed by the quiet strength of a woman who had done nothing but care. That night, for the first time in months, he stepped into Isabella's room alone. His hand lingered on the doorknob, trembling, before he pushed it open. The air was stale, thick with memory. Photographs of brighter days lined the dresser. Clothes still hung in the closet as though waiting for her return. On the vanity lay a wooden box he had avoided for months. Inside, he found trinkets, mementos, and a letter with his name written in her hand. As he read, Isabella's voice returned to him, as if carried by the walls themselves. "Don't try to do this alone," she had written. "Let someone help you carry it. Let the boys feel joy again." The tears came then, hot and unrelenting, and for the first time, he didn't fight them. Celine had forced him to face what he had denied, that grief had become his prison, and his children were suffering for it. Her words had cracked open the door he had sealed, and Isabella's letter had pushed it wider. For the first time, Alexander realized that letting someone in wasn't betrayal, it was survival. The walls he had built so carefully began to tremble, and though he did not yet know how to lower them fully, he knew one thing. Celine Carter had spoken the truth. Love was never meant to be locked away. The letter had been tucked away for months, hidden in a wooden box Alexander Reed had not dared to touch. When he finally unfolded the paper, the familiar handwriting shook him more than any storm could. Isabella's words were simple but unyielding. "Don't try to do this alone. Let someone help you carry it. Let the boys feel joy again." He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling, tears tracing his cheeks without shame this time. It was the first time he had cried since the funeral. Until that moment, his grief had been silent, locked tight inside his chest, guarded by pride and fear. But Isabella's voice, echoing from the page, broke through every wall he had built. She hadn't left him without guidance. She had known him too well, known how stubbornly he would hold on to guilt, how fiercely he would cling to silence. And in her quiet wisdom, she had given him permission. Permission to let go, permission to live, permission to let love return. The weight of it was unbearable, and yet liberating. For months he had believed that moving forward meant betraying her. But Isabella's letter told him otherwise. She wanted their children to laugh again. She wanted him to allow joy back into the home. And suddenly, Alexander understood what he had been refusing to see all along. Celine Carter wasn't erasing Isabella's memory, she was answering Isabella's wish. That realization began to change everything. The following days revealed moments Alexander could no longer dismiss. One night, when Noah woke with a fever, Alexander stood helpless by the doorway, uncertain how to soothe him. Celine was already there, calm and unflinching. She held the child against her chest, pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, and whispered words that steadied his trembling body. Within minutes, Noah's cries softened into tired breaths, his small hand curled around her sleeve as if it had always belonged there. Alexander watched, feeling both humbled and grateful. He had wanted to be the strong one, but it was Celine who carried the strength that mattered, the kind that brought peace to frightened children. Another afternoon, while tidying the twins' room, Alexander discovered a battered notebook lying beneath a pillow. He opened it absent-mindedly, only to freeze at the sight of what lay inside. Scribbled in crayon were stick figures. Two small boys, each labeled with their names, Oliver and Mason. Beside them stood a taller figure with loose curls and a bright red dress. Underneath, in uneven, clumsy letters, one word was written again and again. Mama. He stared at the page until his vision blurred. This wasn't confusion. His children had not mistaken Celine for Isabella. They had chosen. In their innocence, they had carved out space. In their hearts for someone who had loved them into laughter again. And in their unsteady handwriting, they told him the truth he had been afraid to speak. Celine was no longer just a grading caretaker. She had become family. When he handed the notebook to her that evening, Alexander's voice carried a softness she had never heard from him before. You're a part of them, he said quietly. I think I didn't want to admit it before. Maybe because it scared me. But it's the truth. Celine's eyes widened, surprise flickering before she lowered her gaze. I never meant to take anything from you, or from her, she murmured. You didn't, he replied firmly. You gave them something they needed. Something I couldn't. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It wasn't the silence of grief, but of recognition. Something had shifted. For the first time, Alexander allowed himself to acknowledge what his endacker children had known for weeks. Celine had become their anchor, their safe place, their mama. But it wasn't only the children who felt the change. Slowly, Alexander himself began to lean toward the light she carried. He found himself lingering in the hallway just to listen when she read bedtime stories in silly voices that made Oliver giggle. He caught himself watching her. In the garden, helping Mason water the flowers they had planted together, her laughter rising with his. And one evening, when she sang softly in the boys' room, he stood outside the door, tears streaming silently, because the melody reached not only his children's wounds but his own. Isabella's letter had been right. Healing wasn't something he could do alone. And though it terrified him to admit, Celine had become the bridge between what was lost and what might still be found. One morning, over breakfast, Oliver pointed at Celine and declared, "She makes pancakes. Like Mommy." The word should have broken him. Instead, Alexander felt his lips twitch into the smallest smile. It wasn't a replacement, he realized. It was continuity. His sons weren't forgetting their mother, they were learning to live with love again. Later that week, as the boys tumbled into Celine's lap, covering her with crayons and papers, Alexander finally understood what Isabella's letter had meant. Let someone help you carry it. Celine had carried them all, gently, quietly, without asking for recognition. And now, he could no longer deny the truth. For the first time since Isabella's death, the mansion no longer felt like a tomb. It breathed. Again, with laughter, with music, with warmth. And though Alexander's grief had not disappeared, it no longer drowned him. There was something else in its place now. Something fragile, but alive. Celine Carter had not been hired to heal. Yet through her patience, her tenderness, and the trust she had earned from two small boys, she had become the very heartbeat of their home. And Alexander, once terrified of betraying the past, now knew the truth. She was not a threat to Isabella's memory. She was the fulfillment of her wish. The news came quietly, like a whisper that stole the breath from Alexander Reed's lungs. Celine Carter had received an offer, an opportunity in Boston, at a school for neurodivergent children. It was the kind of position she had dreamed of, one that aligned with her heart, her skills, her purpose. She told him in a soft voice, almost apologetic, though she owed him no apology. Her eyes didn't shine with triumph, they shimmered with uncertainty, as if she, too, understood the weight those words carried. Alexander had always known she was not bound to his house forever. She had her own story, her own ambitions, her own path waiting beyond the walls of his grief. Yet the thought of her leaving struck him harder than he imagined. For the first time since Isabella's death, the mansion had felt alive again, laughter in the hallways, toys scattered underfoot, the sound of lullabies spilling through the walls. And at the center of it all was Celine. Without her, he feared, the silence would return, heavier than before. He tried to respond with composure, to mask the panic building inside him. "Thank you for everything you've done," he said, the words stiff and shallow. The moment they left his lips, he regretted them. Celine's face tightened ever so slightly, her eyes lowering as though she had just been dismissed. She nodded once, politely, and left the room. That night, the house felt strange alive in one corner, yet hollow everywhere else. Oliver and Mason, oblivious to the weight pressing on their father, curled into Celine's arms as she read them stories. Alexander stood at the doorway, unseen, as Mason pressed a kiss to her cheek and whispered, "Good night, Mommy." It was no longer a slip of the tongue. It was deliberate, intentional. And when Oliver echoed the word, Alexander's heart fractured. He was not losing just one person. He was losing three. The following days blurred together. Celine continued her duties with the same quiet grace, but there was something different in the way she lingered. Her laughter was softer, her smiles thinner, her bedtime kisses stretched a second too long, as though she were memorizing what she would soon leave behind. Alexander noticed, but he said nothing. He told himself it wasn't his place, that she had the right to chase her dreams. Yet at night, as he paced the floor of his study, the truth clawed at him. He didn't want her to go. Still, the words refused to leave his throat. Fear silenced him. Fear of rejection, fear of need. Fear that asking her to stay would mean asking her to choose between her life and his broken one. So he built another wall, convincing himself that detachment would ease the inevitable. He came home later, spoke less, left the boys in her care even more often. But his withdrawal only deepened the ache. The more he tried to prepare for her absence, the more unbearable it became. The breaking point came one night when he peeked into the twins' bedroom. Both boys were asleep, but clutched tightly in their small arms was one of Celine's floral dresses, crumpled like a blanket. Oliver's fingers held the fabric as though it anchored him to safety, while Mason had buried his face in its folds. The sight ripped through Alexander. His sons had already chosen her as their mother, their safe place, their home. And he, too afraid to speak, was about to let her go. That night, he sat at his desk with an old leather-bound notebook Isabella had once given him. The inscription on the first page read, "For when you can't say it out loud." He had never used it before. But now, his hands shook as he tore out a sheet of paper and began to write. The words stumbled at first, clumsy and raw, but soon poured out of him like a flood. He wrote of his failures, the coldness, the silence, the walls he had built to keep her out. He admitted what he had never dared say aloud, that he had failed his sons after Isabella's death, burying himself in guilt instead of love. He confessed that Celine had given the boys something he could not: safety, warmth, joy. And that for that, he owed her more than he could ever repay. But most of all, he wrote of his fear. Fear of losing her. Fear of watching the light she carried walk out of their lives, leaving the house in darkness once more. Fear that his sons, who had finally learned to laugh again, would return to shadows without her. "I don't want you to stay as an employee," he wrote. "You're not just someone who helps. You are already a part of us. The boys have chosen you. And though I am still learning how to let myself choose, I know this much: I am terrified of losing you. Please, don't leave us behind." When he finished, Alexander folded the letter with trembling fingers. He didn't know if it was too much or too little, if it would make her feel trapped or burdened. But silence was no longer an option. Quietly, he walked down the hall to her room and slipped the envelope beneath her door. He did not wait for a response. He returned to his study, his heart pounding, his mind restless. For the first time in months, he did not seek refuge in silence. He had said what mattered, even if only on paper. The rest was no longer in his hands. As he sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, Alexander realized something Isabella's letter had tried to teach him. Love wasn't about control or certainty. It was about courage. Courage to speak, courage to hope, courage to let someone in. And that night, for the first time, he prayed. Not for the strength to endure loss, but for the chance to hold on to the fragile, miraculous gift that had walked into his home disguised as a stranger and become family. When Celine Carter read the letter Alexander Reed had slipped beneath her door, she stayed awake until dawn. The words were clumsy in places, uncertain in others, but honest in a way that pierced through her doubts. He had confessed his fear, his gratitude, and most of all, his need. Not for help with the house, not for convenience, but for her. For what she had become to Oliver, to Mason, and though he had barely admitted it, to him. She carried the folded paper in her hands when she entered the living room that morning. Alexander sat with the boys, both of them pressed against his chest in rare stillness. When his eyes met hers, they were uncertain, searching. She raised the letter wordlessly, her hands trembling. "I need to know," she whispered, her voice low but steady, "if you meant every word." He stood, carefully setting Oliver and Mason on the couch, and crossed to her. "Every one of them," he said, his voice rough but certain. "If I could go back, I'd have said it sooner. You're not just someone here to work, Celine. You're part of us." Her breath caught. For years, she had trained herself to believe she was temporary everywhere. She went replaceable in every life she touched. Yet here, in this mansion that had once been silent as a tomb, two small boys had wrapped themselves around her heart, and their father, grieving, guarded, but undeniably sincere, was asking her to stay. The decision wasn't logical. It wasn't about wages or contracts. It wasn't even about sacrifice. It was about belonging. She looked down as Oliver tugged at her skirt, his lips trembling. "Stay, Mama," he whispered. Mason echoed him softly, his eyes wide with the same plea. Celine dropped to her knees, gathering them both into her arms, her tears spilling freely into their hair. "Okay," she whispered against their foreheads. "I'll stay." From that day forward, the house shifted in ways even Alexander hadn't expected. Where there had once been sterile silence, there was now sound, music, laughter, voices, overlapping in messy harmony. The grand marble kitchen no longer smelled only of polish and disinfectant, but of cinnamon, bread rising in the oven, and pancakes made on lazy Saturday mornings. On the front porch, Celine and the boys planted pots of herbs and flowers, brightening the once empty space with splashes of green and yellow. Crayon drawings found their way to the point varies. Refrigerator door, crooked and colorful, signed with 3 names instead of 2. Shoes often mismatched, cluttered the hallway. Toy blocks disappeared beneath couches, only to be rediscovered with laughter later. Alexander, who had once walked the halls like a ghost, found himself stepping into the life around him. At first, it was awkward helping Mason with his puzzles, reading to Oliver at night when Celine was tired. But slowly, he rediscovered the rhythm of fatherhood, no longer watching from the doorway, but participating. It wasn't only about the boys. He and Celine began to build something together, not romance, in the grand, sweeping sense, but trust, respect. A quiet companionship that grew in the Clavins spaces where grief had once reigned. He admired the way she never demanded from him. How? She simply gave what she had: her patience, her steadiness, her laughter, and, in return, received the most sacred thing of all, his children's love. Some evenings, after the boys were asleep, they shared coffee at the kitchen table. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer heavy with unspoken grief, but warm with understanding. He would ask about her grandmother in Harlem, and she would tell stories of dancing barefoot in a tiny kitchen while old soul music played on the radio. She would ask about his childhood in Connecticut, and he would laugh about sneaking cookies before dinner, while his mother pretended not to notice. These moments were small, almost ordinary, but they stitched together something extraordinary, the beginnings of a partnership. They did not erase Isabella's memory. Nothing could. Instead, they honored it by continuing to live, to love, to create joy in the spaces she had left behind. The twins flourished under this new harmony. Their night terrors faded, replaced by the sound of whispered secrets shared beneath blankets. They argued, They tested boundaries. They played until exhaustion, but always they ran back into Celine's arms. The word mama no longer carried hesitation. It was their truth, spoken freely, and no one corrected them. For Alexander, the change was subtle but undeniable. He no longer dreaded returning home. The mansion, once suffocating, now breathed. Some mornings, he rescheduled meetings to take part in breakfast chaos, helping Mason build towers out of cereal boxes, while Oliver insisted on pouring too much syrup. Other nights, he found himself proofreading Celine's notes for her evening classes, pride flickering quietly in his chest as she pursued her dream of specializing in early childhood education. Celine, too, had changed. Her laughter rang louder now, her steps carried more certainty. She no longer looked over her shoulder as though bracing for rejection. Instead, she moved through the house with belonging, as though she had always been meant to be there. It was not perfect. Grief still lived with them, sometimes surfacing in the quiet hours when Alexander paused too long in the doorway of Isabella's old room, or when Mason asked a question about the mother he barely remembered. But grief no longer defined them. It existed, alongside gratitude, alongside hope, and so, the house was no longer just Alexander Reed's mansion. It was Oliver and Mason's playground, Celine's sanctuary, and, at last, a home again. They had not replaced what was lost. They had chosen, instead, to build something new, fragile at first, then stronger each day. A family not bound by blood alone, but by choice, by love, and by the courage to begin again. The papers were signed on a quiet afternoon, without ceremony, yet carrying the weight of everything that had been lost, and everything that had been found. Alexander Reed sat beside Celine Carter as the ink dried, the legal declaration simple but profound. She was no longer just a presence in the house. She was, in every way that mattered, the mother of Oliver and Mason. The twins accepted it without hesitation. To them, nothing had changed, because in their hearts Celine had long been Mama. They ran through the halls shouting the name with joy, their voices echoing against walls that had once held only silence. Alexander watched them, his chest aching, but this time, it wasn't with grief. It was fullness. Of gratitude. Of peace. Of the knowledge that love had not abandoned them. It had returned, unexpected and humble, through a woman who had walked into their lives when the darkness seemed endless. The mansion itself seemed transformed. Where once it stood as a monument to sorrow, it now pulsed with life. Laughter spilled from the kitchen, crayon drawings covered the refrigerator, the scent of warm bread drifted into every corner. Flowers bloomed on the porch, toys cluttered the floors, and Alexander no longer dreaded the quiet of night, because the house was no longer empty. It was whole again. In Celine's steady presence, Alexander had rediscovered not only family, but the courage to live without fear of betraying the past. Isabella's memory remained sacred, but it no longer weighed him down. It had become a foundation for the new life they were building. This story reminds us that family is not only written in blood, but in the choices we make, the patience we show, and the love we give freely. Loss may leave us broken, but healing often comes from unexpected places. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is to open the locked doors of our hearts and let love find its way back in. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your reflections. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel, so together we can keep spreading stories of hope, love, and second chances.